Right, so I guess we can start. As you realize, there's a sort of a clash of activities, okay? It's not a clash of scales, or maybe it is, but it's a clash of activities because the department is celebrating its 50th anniversary starting today. But luckily, the celebration goes on for a full week with various events, open to all of you, of course, and to other people, including ethnographic film and debates and things. So we're not going to miss everything. And at 2:15 today, there's a lecture by an invited speaker, Professor Henriette Moore, who's going to tell us something about the state of the art and where she feels that we should be going. So I'm sure that's going to be very exciting to take part of. But for now, it's the 9th installment in our series on accelerated change, the anthropology of overheating. As you realize, I had so much fun last week with Prezi, using Prezi as a presentation tool, that I'm doing it again this week. I don't know about next time, but I'm giving it a try this week again to see how it works. And last week we spoke about, or rather I spoke about some of the, you might say, the dialectics of identity, okay, and the issues to do with collective identities in situations of change. And today we turn to perhaps a more basic, perhaps a more fundamental, at least a more physical aspect of accelerated change to do with energy. Energy has not really been a central topic, obviously, in the social sciences because it has been part of a different faculty most of the time. And indeed, the philosopher Bertrand Russell, speaking about the social sciences sometime in the interwar years, once said that power is to the social sciences what energy is to the natural sciences, meaning that everybody knows it's incredibly important, but nobody can define it. We may have made some progress since then, both regarding power and regarding energy. But the point being that when we study energy in the social sciences and in anthropology, we have a different approach, right? We have a social and cultural approach to energy, and we're interested in how energy articulates with, affects, and forms part of social and cultural formations. Energy has not been a big issue in anthropology. Now let's see if I can get this to work. Yes, I can. Great. Well, as it says on the slide, the anthropological interest in energy has been uneven and largely quite limited. The British school in anthropology, since the 1920s, well, since just after the First World War, had a strong interest in politics, kinship, the question of cohesion. I mean, the big question asked by the British anthropologists, and this went on well into the 1950s and possibly even the 60s, a main question was, how are societies integrated? What are the mechanisms that integrate societies? And they were especially interested in stateless societies. I mean, there was a strong focus for a couple of decades on African stateless societies, the segmentary societies. And the question was raised as to how they were politically integrated. Who holds power? What's the role of kinship? How do they reproduce themselves over time, etc.? Structural functionalism. And then came the critique of structural functionalism through people like Frederick Barth and others, Raymond Firth, who instead looked at individuals. How can individuals improve their situation? Okay? So we got the concept of the entrepreneur, for example, and the strategic actor in anthropology. And again, this was all about you might say, societal arrangements, not so much about what kind of societies we're dealing with. American anthropology, similarly, in much of the 20th century, had a strong focus on symbolic culture, on meaning. How are worlds being made meaningful? And what are the differences between cultures, as they would say then, regarding how they construct the world as culturally meaningful universes? So there seems to have been a void regarding the physical foundations of society. There were some exceptions, and I'm coming to that in a minute. But one main reason was that 20th century anthropology in the most influential countries, academic countries. So we could count, in addition to the UK and the United States, you could mention France, and to some extent Germany, at least before the Second World War, when German anthropology suddenly collapsed, right, in 1945. They were reacting against earlier tendencies in anthropology, associated with people like Lewis Henry Morgan. Victorian anthropology, 1850s and 60s, most of it non-Marxist, but there were some anthropologists even then who had an interest in Marx. And 19th century Victorian anthropology was largely evolutionist. There was this idea, okay, that societies evolve from simpler forms to more complex forms. Morgan being the first and probably most important anthropological evolutionist of the 19th century. And in his evolutionary scheme, humanity passes through 7 stages, okay? 7 stages. There are 3 stages of savagery, okay? 3 stages of savagery. There's the sort of the lower, the middle, and upper savagery, okay? And then you have an important transition from savagery to barbarism, okay? So the savage becomes a barbarian when, this is 19th century terminology. When he, because it was always a he in the 19th century, it was never a she, when he discovers the plough, agriculture, beasts of burden, etc. So you have the transition between savagery to barbarism with the agricultural revolution. But the point that I wanted to make about Morgan is that, and then you have the 3 stages of barbarism, and at the end you have the 7th stage, which is civilization. And that's us. Well, it's him. You know. But Morgan was not a stupid man, okay? He was very good. He was the one who introduced kinship studies in anthropology, and he distinguished between different kinds of kinship terminologies. He did fieldwork very early, generations before Malinowski. He worked with the Iroquois in upstate New York and wrote about them. Excuse me. And he was admitted into the Iroquois tribe as an honorary member. But the point I wanted to make about Morgan is that his transitions between the stages were based on technological advances. And you could say, although he didn't put it in so many words, that it was to do with the amount of energy that a society was able to exploit from its surroundings. So, in other words, an interest in these physical dimensions of society to do with the ways in which we are capable of exploiting the energy in our surroundings became associated with an obsolete and an old-fashioned form of anthropology, namely evolutionism. So there was a lack of interest in technology in mainstream anthropology for decades after this shift in the early 20th century towards, as I said, in one branch of anthropology, politics, kinship, etc., in another branch, symbols, meaning, art, etc. So that was Morgan. And it would take almost 100 years before Morgan was properly rediscovered in America, in American anthropology, because Franz Boas and his students were ruling the roost. I mean, they dominated American anthropology with their more symbolic approaches for more than, well, at least for 40 years. I might mention as a footnote that 2 of the people who were strongly influenced by Morgan were Marx and Engels. I mean, Marx, who never managed to complete his ethnographic, or rather his work on what he called the pre-capitalist societies, but in his ethnographic notebooks, which have been compiled and which can be accessed. It turns out that he spent a lot of time in the British Library reading Morgan. And Engels, who lived longer than Marx, okay, he died in 1895, draws extensively on Morgan in his work on the origin of property and the family and so on. But in anthropology, as such, it would take, as I said, generations before somehow someone started to dig out some insights from Morgan and apply them again. And the main character that we're looking at here, I'm going to talk a bit about, is Leslie White. And I'm going to say a little bit more about Leslie White later on. He's also an anthropologist who was in opposition to the mainstream. He explicitly opposed the Boasians. He wanted to reintroduce evolutionary thinking, social evolutionism in anthropology. This was just after the Second World War. And the article that you're reading by him, in fact, came before his more famous programmatic statements. It's from 1943, so it was published during the Second World War on social and cultural evolution. And Leslie White tried to operationalize cultural evolution in a very objective way by stating simply that cultural evolution can be measured as the amount of energy harnessed, exploited, used by a society, used in the environment. Now this is, to an anthropology, to standard cultural relativist anthropologists, this of course is anathema. But to people who work in development, it's common sense. It's almost common sense. So yeah, let me just run through the first slide before I move on to say a few more things about White, just to give you an introduction to the things I'm going to be saying later on in this lecture. By the 1960s, late 1950s, 1960s, now Leslie White and his students, from the end of the Second World War and through the 50s and the 60s, from the mid-1960s, an interest in Marxism was revived in anthropology. And with it came at least an interest in technology. Because in Marxist theory, the means of production is a central term, right? The infrastructure of a society in the Marxist term, not the infrastructure in everyday language, but infrastructure in the Marxist terms, is composed of two main elements, okay? The means of production, that's the technology, and the relations of production, that's property relations, and technology. So of course energy is important there, although, as it says here, it's rarely theorized explicitly. Later we have a new, and that's probably what I'm going to spend the second period talking about during this lecture. We have a new interest in energy, which has not so much to do with ideas about social evolution or even complexity or even development, but about the environment, energy and the environment. Because of the widespread feeling that many intellectuals and other people have these days that somehow we have painted ourselves into a corner, as we say in Norwegian, and we are about to undermine the foundations of our own existence because we've been too successful at exploiting and harnessing and using energy for the general improvement of humanity. This is a very, very sort of standard double bind, and it's very central to some of the work we do at Overheating. And it can be illustrated like this. It's a double bind, right? The kind of dilemma which has no solution. Damned if you don't, damned if you do it. No matter what you do, somehow it's wrong. And let me illustrate it very briefly, this kind of the double bind that many current environmental anthropologists are working with, often with an explicit perspective on energy. Excuse me. And of course, three of the articles that you're reading somehow relate to this double bind. Hal Wilhite probably most explicitly in a very recent article that was published last year. Okay, so the illustration. Front page of the leading newspaper in Norway, Aftenposten, some years back. There were two stories. Well, there were several stories, but there were two stories that I noticed. One of them was the now almost iconic image of a polar bear on a sort of shrinking patch of ice, okay, floating somewhere in the Arctic Ocean. In other words, climate change is happening, it's affecting the Arctic areas, and it's bad news for the polar bears. Same page, a very upbeat article about the growth in civilian air traffic in Norway. That at Gardermoen Airport, Oslo Airport, there's been a very healthy growth in the last few years, so we're making more money. People travel more, and it's really good for the economy. What can you say? And why isn't there a single commentator inside the newspaper who can write a column where it says that, look, I mean, you can say this and you can say that, but you probably shouldn't be saying both things at the same time because it creates a double bind. When you read this, you feel very helpless. What am I going to do? Who am I going to listen to? You can't do both at the same time. So this is the double bind that many anthropologists are working with today in different ways. But some also have other approaches. And let me just mention before I move on that in fact, quite early on, Margaret Mead took a strong interest in what she called the planetary environment. And on climate, and may have been the first anthropologist in the 1970s. She died in 1978 to address questions to do with climate change. At the time, there was no established theory about global warming, but there was an encroaching feeling already in the 1970s among some intellectuals and activists that we human beings were doing things to the environment which probably was a bad idea, you know, in the long run, because it might actually destroy some of the elements of our planets that we need for survival. Okay, and now, you can read the rest yourself. I don't have to tell you about it, but let me just tell you as an illustration of some of the ways in which anthropologists have been working with energy recently. A Norwegian researcher, Tanja Winther, who's at the Center for Development and the Environment at SUM, has been writing about electrification in Zanzibar, which is a very exciting thing. Electrification. What happens when people get electricity? What do they use it for? How does it affect their everyday life? How does it affect productivity? There are people in the development business, people who are interested in a certain form of economic development, who have argued that if you want to if you only have one button to press, okay, in order to help Africans somehow develop their societies, infrastructure, education, the economy, get things rolling in Africa, get the economic takeoff that people have been talking about for 50 years. If you just have one button to press the button that says electrification. You know, with electricity in African villages, all of a sudden children can start to do their homework. You know, I mean, there are a number of sort of obvious things that you can do. All of a sudden, life can go on for much longer. Electrification in our part of the world led to a reduction in the number of hours people sleep at night. Okay, from around between 8 and 9 hours to around 7 hours after we got electricity, because with electric light. I don't know about you, but I've done fieldwork in places where there wasn't electric light, and when the sun sets at around 7. Somehow everything slows down. It's very hard then to determine. I mean, you can sit in candlelight, okay, and write down your field notes, but there are many things that you can't do, and so productivity goes down, and people go to sleep earlier, and they may get up a bit earlier, but not that much earlier. And what some may ask, but that's tangential to the question of energy, but it has a lot to do with technology and society, is what happens to the amount of sleep with the world of gadgets. With the world of gadgets, for example, and smartphones. I have made some observations myself of teenagers who go to bed and they say goodnight to their parents, and then you sort of look into the bedroom around midnight, and you still see that sort of bluish flickering light from the far corner. Because there's always a Facebook update to make, and there's always a message to send. So this would be an extension of the argument about what electrification did. But the point is that electricity and energy, it's crucial. You know, it's an oversight not to take it into your societal analysis. There was a very fun book. I haven't been able to dig it out. This young man who's operating the camera, in fact, is writing a dissertation, an MA dissertation about energy in Nepal. And I've been trying to dig it up again, not least for his sake and for my own, but I haven't been able to, by a Danish anthropologist called Sten Bergendorf, which is about the introduction of electricity, but it was only partial in the New Guinea village, and how it led to the formation of new alliances. They had their traditional alliances and conflicts and divisions in the village between different moieties and so on, but all of a sudden the division was between the people who had access to electricity and those who didn't. So there is some work on this, but let's move on. Yeah, global energy use. Just to give you an illustration of overheating, of accelerated change. World energy consumption. I mean, this speaks for itself, doesn't it? The new concept of the Anthropocene, you know, the new geological era, the Anthropocene. which was proposed a little more than 10 years ago by a geophysicist, Kreutzen. It refers to a new geological era in the history of the planet, and that is the era where human activity has influences the planet so much that it is being transformed, and that the planet would have looked very different without human activity. There is some disagreement as to when to start. When did the Anthropocene begin? When did the Holocene end and the Anthropocene begin? If we agree that this may be a good concept, and I think it is, I should say, well, maybe 1820, or maybe around the time of Napoleon, because that is when large-scale extraction of coal started. And you know, the Industrial Revolution in a country like England, Britain, would have been impossible. It would have been unthinkable without large-scale extraction of coal. Yes, coal had been used for a long time. Even oil had been used in the Middle East for oil lamps, but not to fuel or to fire steam engines or machinery or big ships, you know, or to heat up buildings, etc., or for air conditioning in hot places. One hadn't used oil for these things, or to produce electricity. So you might say the happy marriage between James Watt, okay, and the coal mine was the start of the Industrial Revolution. Because without this fantastically compact, movable, versatile source of energy, which is coal, which is compressed, you know, compressed energy. It's condensed sunlight, black condensed sunlight. Without that, the Industrial Revolution would have been called off after just a few years, because by then there wouldn't have been any trees left, right? Because the trees were the main source of heat and energy before the extractive revolution. So maybe this is when it started. Around this time we were about, I've spoken about this before, but let me just remind you, around this time we were about 1 billion altogether. So the Anthropocene hadn't really set in. There were large areas of the world which were chiefly unaffected by human activity. And today, well, the world is affected by human activity, and it now even shows in the climate. We even notice it in the climate. So this is, as you can see, healthy growth. Many people are not aware of it, but there's still a healthy growth in coal. It's still, the consumption of coal is still growing. It's going down in Europe, but it's increasing in other parts of the world. Okay, let's move to the next. Now this is the world per capita consumption, which is also quite interesting, because you know the previous slide, it only showed the total consumption, but of course the population has grown. But per person, each of us, each individual, now consumes far less biofuel than we did in 1820. About a quarter of the amount of biofuel. We no longer, many of us anyway, we no longer use wood to heat our homes and so on. But we use a lot more of other kinds of energy. So there's been a quadrupling. Okay, it's increased fourfold. The average energy consumption has increased fourfold. But it is not evenly distributed. I mean, here we are, per capita use for selected countries. I mean, compare Iceland with Ethiopia, and you see the point, that this is not evenly distributed at all. Now, Norway is very high up, just above Canada, and way above Sweden. So we cannot blame the cold climate for using so much energy in Norway. There's a short answer to this, I guess. Well, you now think I'm going to say oil. No, I mean, most of the Norwegian oil is exported. But so the short answer is hydroelectricity. Cheap, abundant hydroelectricity. And the very energy-intensive industry, aluminum industry in the western part of the country, for example, which relies on hydroelectric power. But this is just to illustrate that we of course we know, but let's remind ourselves of the fact that energy, applies, the growth in energy use applies in very different ways in different countries. Of course, one of the most exciting countries in which to look at energy now is China, which is simultaneously at the global cutting edge regarding renewables, such as solar power, and is increasing very fast its consumption of coal. Yeah, so let's move on. And now let's move back to Leslie White and his theories excuse me, about humanity. Now you can read his article yourself. I'd just like to point out a couple of things which are not in the article, which is about cultural evolution, some might say increasing social complexity. Of course, it does make a difference whether you have, say, electricity or a steam engine, or whether you don't. And it was calculated sometime as early as I think the 1940s, was it? 1940s, maybe 1950s, in the United States, that with the amount of machine power at every American's disposal, at the average American's disposal, the amount of machine power, it roughly equaled the manpower of 100 slaves. You see what I mean? I mean, say you have a car, okay? And even if it's a family car, the car has 50 horsepower. I don't know how many horsepower a car has. Let's say it has 50, maybe more, 50 horsepower. And that would be the equivalent of maybe 70 slaves. No, more than that. 50 horsepower, more than 70 slaves. 50 horses. Blimey. Several hundred slaves. Refrigerators. Radios. Electric light. I mean, all of these aids that we have, which transform everyday life and which are based on, I wouldn't say necessarily code, but they're based on energy, on high levels of energy use. But there is one thing that I should mention about White, which is not obvious, and it is that in spite of the fact that he was a materialist, and he has often been accused of being a technological determinist, in the sense that technology, the idea that technology shapes society. With a certain kind of society, you get a certain kind of technology. And yeah, there are lots of formulations in White's writings which lend themselves to this view. But at the same time, he saw culture as being largely autonomous, largely separate, symbolic culture. I mean, he has a great example. I think I was in one of his lectures that White had this example where he places a glass of water on the table, and he says that this can be, in the context of religion, it's sacred water. It can be sacred water, the kind of water you use for baptism. And but if I just leave it here on this table, it's just something I can drink, you know. So the same substance with the same molecules can be two completely different things in different cultural contexts, and that has nothing to do with technology, nothing to do with energy. It's culture. So and if any of you are interested and like to read up on these things, there's a nice book by Marcel Salins, who was a student of White, called Culture and Practical Reason. And Salins himself started out as a card-carrying cultural evolutionist, and he then changed. He changed 2 or 3 times, I think, in his career, his approach, and left evolutionism behind for a form of structuralist informed cultural relativism, you might say, in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And yeah, evolution of culture. Again, I mean, if anybody has a particular interest in energy, read The Evolution of Culture, because it's a unique document in the history of anthropology. It was very unfashionable even when it came out. The Boasians, the symbolically oriented anthropologists, hated it. But he went on and he chugged on, and he was at the University of Michigan until his death. And these are some points from White's approach. And it's fairly, yeah, I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? It stands to reason, doesn't it? Technology is an attempt to solve the problems of survival. Well, it can also be lots of other things. You know, I'm one of the people who believe that if you're going to introduce a new form of information technology, new kind of information technology, it's got to have an element of games or play or fun. Otherwise, it's not going to work. I mean, mobile phones really took off when they managed to put little games into them, so you could play Snake, the most primitive. You remember those? Snake or Pong on your little screen, okay, using a keyboard. But still, many forms of technology are, of course, about enhancing human life and solving the problems of survival. Technology doesn't have to be intrinsically linked to energy. It could be the wheel. The wheel is not about energy, but it's about technology. But White focuses on energy, and he says that means capturing enough energy and diverting it for human needs. Well, yep, and that those which are more energetic have an advantage over other societies. I would say that yes, let's add to this, okay? Societies that capture more energy and use it more efficiently have an advantage over other societies, comma, all other things being equal. I think we should introduce that little caveat, lest we become technological determinists as well. And these are more advanced in an evolutionary sense, because he believed in that sort of step-like evolution of societies from the simple to the more complex, and uses energy as a way of making sense of that. Excuse me. Which anthropologists no longer do. But what I would like to stress, and what we can learn from White, is that energy use in a society, it says a lot about what kind of society you have and the kind of energy you have at your disposal. It says a lot, and it contributes to explaining aspects of complexity. Right, now let's see where we're going from here. Oh yes, that's his formula. E times T equals P. Yeah. So, yeah, and I've put some examples. I mean, I don't have to read this out now because we're going to be running out of time, as usual. But some further points that we can find, both in White's own writings and that we can extrapolate from his writings, are to do with the growth of complexity. Now, there is an anthropology of complexity that compares different societies. But often, different degrees of complexity are explained without looking at, for one thing, productive factors. I mean, mostly Marxist anthropologists have done that, and for another, energy use. And perhaps we could say that had it not been for technological advances, the division of labor, the state, etc., would not have been capable of coming about. You know, wind is one of the oldest forms of energy, okay, that man has diverted for his own purposes. The sailing ship as a means of trade across the Mediterranean and in the Far East, and so on. Yeah. Now, yes, and there's one big shortcoming seen from, there are two big shortcomings seen from 2014 in Leslie White's works. Again, I'm not saying that. There are shortcomings, but there are also things to be learned from them. One of them, as I said, being his somehow unilineal evolutionism, the idea that societies pass through stages, which doesn't fit the facts on the ground, because societies change in very many different ways, and different parts of a society can change at different speeds. And the other being his total lack of interest in politics and power, which also seems a little bit wanting. Unlike in Marx and Marxism, where there is a very strong emphasis on politics and power. There is a famous quotation by Marx, which goes approximately like this, and he also would say man, okay? That's man. Not man or woman. This was the 19th century, okay? Man creates history, but he does not do so under conditions of his own choice. In other words, you are already framed by a certain material and social structure that shapes and limits your opportunities. So, in other words, in Marxism, there's a stronger emphasis on human agency and on politics and power than it would be in White, who doesn't look at these things at all. But there is also a famous quotation by Marx down here, I don't know if you can read it, on the hand mill and the steam mill, which is also infamous. The hand mill gives you society with a feudal lord, the steam mill society with industrial capitalism. Because under feudalism, labor was cheap, right? Labor was very cheap, and it had to be cheap. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been possible to run these large estates. So the price of labor was being pushed down. Whereas with the steam mill, and with industrial advances, industrial development, you need fewer people, fewer laborers, right? Where in the past you needed 10,000, now you maybe you just need 500. And there are stories from industrial sociology about the transition of, for example, American industry. There's a story by Richard Sennett, famous and a sociologist who writes about a bakery in New England somewhere. And he says, well, he first did fieldwork there in the 1970s, because this is not just about the Industrial Revolution. This is a process that goes on. It's very good to get rid of people in order to save money. I don't know if you've noticed that at the Oslo airport now, when you do the automatic check-in, even the bag drop is now automatic. The bag drop is automatic. There isn't a person behind the counter who takes your bag. You have to register yourself electronically. So they've saved quite a few bucks that way. And the Senate writes about this bakery, where there used to be dozens of people who were milling around baking bread. And then he went back there in the 1990s, and they were no longer baking bread, because everything was computerized. So they had this touch screen that they operated, 100 baguettes, etc., 200 French pain de campagne and so on, and they pushed these buttons. And so all the workers did was really to monitor the machines, and I guess maybe to clean them afterwards. So if the machine broke down, the computer broke down, they had to call for service, because they were no longer capable, or it wasn't possible for them to bake bread the old way anymore. So that's a sort of further development of the society with the steam mill. So technology, important. Now, yes, just one final thing before we move on to the second part of the lecture. Yes, there is this very interesting quotation in White's article that I've put special attention to. Life seems to remain static for thousands of years, and I think this is quite interesting in terms of change. That for a long time very little happened. If you think about transportation technology, the transport technology, the most advanced ships in Europe was the Middle Ages were Chinese. Okay, the Chinese ships, which had the largest sort of radius. Then came the Renaissance in Europe, and an improvement in the technology in ship technology. But still, the speed was not higher than the fastest ships that the Phoenicians used for trade in the Mediterranean 2,000 years ago. Okay, and if you were to travel from Paris to Rome, you might have actually spent longer in 1700 at the time of Louis XIV, okay, longer than you would at the time of Julius Caesar, 2,000 years earlier, or nearly 2,000 years earlier. So there had been a stagnation in transport technology, which was staggering, which hadn't really evolved much for many years. Of course, there were other technologies that changed, but if you look at transportation, not much happened for a very long time anywhere in the world. And then all of a sudden, there was this sort of spurt of creativity and innovation. You've got the hot air balloon, for example, in the late 18th century. Around the same time, or a little bit later, you got the first experimental trains, steam trains, in Europe. Then you got the steamboat. And just a couple of decades afterwards, the telegraph. And the internet, of course, is just a footnote to the telegraph, because the telegraph was the first communication technology that enabled the transmission of a message without an accompanying physical object. So, and it's interesting to think about change in these terms, isn't it? That in certain fields, in certain arenas, certain segments of life, things seem to be pretty static for a very long time. And then, for a very short period, there's this burst of change. And then maybe you reach a new plateau and you have a stable situation again. One reason I'm interested in this, and again, this is a footnote, okay? I'm not going to ask you about this for the exam. Footnote is that in evolutionary theory, there is a model of evolution which is called punctuated equilibrium. Right? Punctuated equilibrium. It's exactly the same thing. For a long time, very little happens in nature. The same species chug on, the same ecosystems, more or less unchanged. And then you have this sort of explosive change. New species, species extinction. Lots of things happening, okay? And then chugs on for a long time without much change, with just a few sort of ripples. And it seems to me that when we think about technological development, perhaps similar models can be used. There was if we go back to the period after the last ice age, there was also a very high level of technological innovation, just in the few thousand years, very warm period after the last ice age. Okay, and then, you know, writing, the state, the plow, they came around the same time. The city, they came around the same time. In China and in the Near East, roughly simultaneously. So, last century, he says, this is around, you know, 1940, okay? So let's say from 1840 to 1940. Has been one of those periods of extraordinary change, the most amazing in human history. If then you ask me to put into one sentence the cause of that recent rapid and enormous change, I should reply, it is found in the discovery and utilization of the means by which heat energy can be made to do man's work for him. So this was, remember, 1940s. There was a faith in industrial progress, which was huge, especially in the United States. And there was also a belief through the 50s and 60s that the rest of the world would follow suit. So the entire world would become the United States if they could only harness the energy in their surroundings. And as I'm just putting in my own little footnote on the slide, that there is no attention here to questions to do with politics, power, etc., inequality. And of course, the environmental issues were not really on the agenda, came on the agenda a few years later when the unintentional side effects of industrialization became more and more visible. I'm also mentioning another book for those who have an interest in these things. Very good book, written in a journalistic style, but informed by social science, by Timothy Mitchell, called Karma Democracy, which is about how the entanglements, you might say, of power and oil. I mean, many people have wondered, why is it that the United States continues to support Saudi Arabia? You know, with its dismal record on human rights, etc., women's rights, you name it, democracy, anything, when they happily go to war in other places, ostensibly to defend the rights of the disenfranchised population. Well, there is a short answer to this. Saudi Arabia was more or less founded by the Americans and the family Saud. You know, there was an interesting place in the sense that it's the only country in the world that's named after a family. And the Arab American Oil Company. So that's a different take, which came much later. And to that family of issues we now move. But we bring with us the insight that, as a matter of fact, the exploitation of energy has created the modern world. Without coal, I would probably not have been standing here, and you wouldn't have been sitting there. I mean, so we must not, in spite of all the side effects, and the environmental crisis and climate change, delude ourselves into believing that modernity would have been possible without the fossil revolution. Modernity is totally dependent on the fossil revolution. And yet, we increasingly now see that we somehow, or there is a feeling, widespread feeling, that something is not right. Let me just give you one anecdote, because I realize that we should take a break very soon. To illustrate this again, the Norwegian adventurer, and I'm emphasizing adventurer, but he was a great adventurer, Thor Heyerdahl, okay? Famous for the Kon-Tiki expedition and later expeditions. He wrote once, I mean, because he had a strong environmental concern, he was very worried about what we human beings are doing to the planet. And he once wrote that, well, when they crossed the Pacific with Kon-Tiki, they could travel for days and weeks without seeing trace of human activity. No trace at all of human activity. A couple of decades later, he crossed the Atlantic with Ra on a similar quest. And he said that every day they passed clumps of tar, of oil, plastic bags, debris, bottles, rubbish. Every day. They passed, several times a day they could make these observations. So in other words, clearly something had happened. An overheating, you might say, had happened in the space of these 2 decades. And on that note, I think we should take a break, and then I'll show you a short YouTube film about fracking afterwards, which is a new controversial way of exploiting fossil fuels. So maybe we'll just start. I think we're missing 1 or 2 people, but they're outside looking at our wonderful photo exhibition, which depicts the history of this department back to 1964. And one of the things that you notice, I mean, when you're interested in this kind of thing, which is not energy, but which is culture, is the changes in dress and hairstyles. I mean, how people dressed in 1964. And And the hair in the 1980s was unspeakably horrible, but everybody thought it was nice at the time. So that's one of the things about looking at these old pictures. Anyway, what I'm going to do now in this part, now in the first part I spoke in a very general way about the anthropology of energy and the energy situation in the world, and I also suggested that there are some tensions around energy. But there are many different kinds of tensions around energy, of course, in many parts of the world where there isn't enough, where people can't get their work done, can't get their activities done in a proper way, either because there is no electricity available, they haven't been able to afford to pay the bill, or because, as in Mikkel's case, the young man behind the camera, his work in Nepal, that the electricity supply is erratic. It is being shut off for hours at a time in the middle of the day, and even if this is planned, it disrupts your work, your everyday routines in ways which make it harder to plan your life the way you want to. So that's one big family of of energy research, or potential energy research, because much of this research hasn't been carried out, at least not to my knowledge. But there is a lot to be done here. Go to an African village where they get electricity, where they get a stable electricity supply, and monitor the changes in people's lives. And what it does. There's an intense interest in mobile phones and what they do, but somehow the interest in electricity and power is less. So, but we can do something about that, and you can do something about that, okay, when you move on to do your own research. So that's one big family of conflict. The other big family of conflict is to do with relationships between energy extraction and broader issues to do with human survival. So the largest discourse is the one about climate, to which I will turn eventually. But there are also many local conflicts. For example, in Australia and in the United States, between farmers and the resource industry. And I've got a couple of short film snippets which illustrate this. The first one simply explains what fracking is, which is a way of extracting unconventional gas. It's called unconventional because it's a new technology. Since the article by Kim de Rijke is about fracking, it does a pretty good job at explaining what it is, but this little video does an even better job. And it also shows how resource-intensive fracking can be. And it also shows that, in spite of the fact that many argue that gas is good, coal is bad, oil is bad, but gas is good. That's a common argument in Norway, not least, because Norway reached peak oil in 2001, right? So Norwegian oil production is declining, but the gas production is still doing pretty well. But in spite of this fact that gas, yes, it is cleaner than the other fossil fuels, but there are so many leaks when you produce gas. And I've got a shocking film later on that I'll show you, which illustrates some of these leaks and the consequences. And if that goes straight into the atmosphere, it's pure methane, which is not good.
What is hydraulic fracturing?
But now, just a few minutes of hydraulic fracturing. Right. You can think about this film not only as a short informative film about fracking, but also as somehow a piece of ethnography, because remember that this YouTube video has been viewed a few 100,000 times, and we may assume that many of the people who have seen it live in areas where there is fracking going on, right, or nearby. So it feeds into popular views or widespread views of what this does, and the sinking feeling that some people have is that what gives us life also contributes to killing us. We need it in order to fuel our motor cars, our elevators, our TV sets, our homes and our industries, transportation, and at the same time it has these unforeseeable but possibly very severe health consequences. So that's a very local take on the double bind that I spoke about previously, right? On the one hand you have climate change, and on the other hand you have a continued growth in fossil fuels. This is a very local take, which becomes very tangible in the town where I've been working in Australia called Gladstone on the Queensland coast. People are not negative to industry. They would start the conversation by saying, I'm not against industry as such, I just feel they should do it right. Because everybody relies on industry for their livelihood. But it's very hard to think that you can do without fossil fuels when you live in a town which is virtually marinated in coal, as is Gladstone, where everybody, directly or indirectly, relies on industry. And at the same time, people have respiratory illnesses. There's a lot of asthma and unclassified respiratory problems in children and adults. It is claimed by industry that this has nothing to do with us, I mean, our cleaning facilities are so good now, you know, that the air, and we've done measurements of the air quality, which indicate that the air is first class in Gladstone. But then the same people who hear this and who have trouble breathing, asthma, whatever, they go on holiday somewhere else, and they go to a nice coastal resort somewhere on the Queensland coast and stay there for a week. Symptoms go away immediately, and they return when they come back to Gladstone. So in other words, their experience contradicts what they are being told by the corporations and by the experts hired by the corporations, which sometimes leads not to a mistrust in science as such, but a mistrust in scientists, because scientists are often paid by the corporations. So there is this fraught situation that we find in the United States, in Australia, and in other parts of the world, where local people increasingly don't trust the experts. So they go on YouTube and they watch films like the one you just saw about fracking, which reinforces their mistrust in the authorities. But then, at the end of the day, they may ask themselves, what am I going to do? I need a living. I need to pay my rent. I need to send my children to get an education. I need to pay for my new car. I want to have a nice holiday, etc. And this is where I can find work. And there aren't jobs elsewhere. So this is a dilemma for local people, which has clearly been underestimated, for example, by the environmental movement, which doesn't engage with these concerns. And that is one of the things that anthropologists should do. Now let me just run through some of the points that I made here on the anthropology of energy, and then I'll speak a little bit about Australia as a case regarding these, some of these local conflicts, which are not, as I said, not necessarily about global climate change, which is very abstract, and which may be too abstract for most of us to get our heads around, but about local effects of, it could be fracking, it could be coal mining, or it could be other ways of extracting energy. Yeah, so we have all of these issues that anthropologists begin to study. There is a fairly comprehensive anthropology of climate change now. Several books are coming out. All of them very new. I mean, virtually all of them published after 2005. In the last 10 years, there's been a sort of flurry of publications in anthropology about climate change and local responses to it and local discourses about climate change. There's also a growing literature about local conflicts. Now, one of the things that Kim de Rijke has done fieldwork on, the guy who wrote the article about fracking in Anthropology Today, who's an anthropologist who works at the University of Queensland in Brisbane. One of the things that he's looking at is the conflict, you might say, between the resource industry and farmers. And I have a couple of things to say about that in a little while. Excuse me. Yes, and the anthropology of energy should also, ideally, but it isn't, I guess, for the time being, fully developed in that direction, be about global inequality, about the differential access to energy. There's a large journalistic literature, there's a political science literature, and a human geography literature about energy and global inequality, and the way in which few of us, I mean, there's a 20-80 rule. 20% of us use 80% of the resources. Right, the 20-80 rule that some of you may have heard from. Yeah, I spoke briefly about it, I think, during the previous lecture. 20% of us use 80% of the energy, and the remaining 80% have to share the remaining 20% of the energy. And finally, an anthropology of renewables and of ecological sustainability, which is also a burgeoning field, simply because it's becoming important for many of our informants. It's not as if you have to go to a Greenpeace office these days to hear people voice concern about what we're doing to the planet. It's become part of the everyday discourse in many countries, but not everywhere, in uneven ways, okay? Yeah, so, fracking as an example. Yeah, I've already showed you a short film about how fracking goes about. And in some of the parts of the world where fracking goes on, such as in the American Midwest, where, as the video pointed out, there is an enormous interest in fracking, largely because the natural gas resources, which could be extracted conventionally, have by and large been depleted. There is agriculture in many of these areas, and there is also a shortage of water. There isn't enough rain. So that in Australia, farmers in the hinterland, farmers in the outback, okay, in Queensland and New South Wales, are totally dependent on aquifers, water that you drill for. Okay, they've got to have a bore on their property so they can drill for water, because rain is unpredictable and scarce. On those very same properties, resource companies come in and they start to drill for gas and other fossil fuels. And you can't legally keep them out. You have to allow them. And as the video again pointed out, unlike with conventional gas, you need lots of these little towers. You need lots of bores in order to exploit this very hard to get, inaccessible gas. And it's full of problems. And I'll show you, I'm going to show you another little film later on, so I won't give everything away now, okay? But there are lots of little problems, not just leaks and contaminations of drinking water, but also of other kinds. So there's a real dilemma here between, you might say, mining in the wide sense, mining for energy on the one hand, and farming on the other hand. And in a country like Australia, this is particularly acute insofar as the Australian identity is based to a great extent on these two activities, mining and farming. Australian history, European settlement in Australia, which started in the late 1700s and sort of took off in the 19th century as a convict colony to begin with, right? Convict colony. Convicts were sent from Britain to the penal colonies in Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, and elsewhere on this new continent. And increasingly, there was a felt need to attract other people to come, people who were not convicts. Many of these convicts had eventually served their sentence, so they became free. But it was a huge continent, and since the Aborigines were not really taken into the equation at all, it was considered largely empty. So one of the ways of attracting Europeans to come, and especially Englishmen, British, was by setting out rumors of mining booms. Okay? They set out rumors of gold rushes. Well, some of those gold rushes were real, some of them were fake. So Europeans started to come. And there's an Australian mythology. There is an American dream about the rags to riches story, right? Which is a sort of a spine of a certain American way of looking at life. And there's also an Australian dream, which is about striking it big through mining, right? All of a sudden, you strike you find gold, right, in large quantities, and you become rich. But you can go on for years without finding much at all. So, in other words, mining essential to the Australian identity and to Australian self-understanding, and farming similarly, especially farming in the outback, where the climate is really, it's very demanding. Okay, it's very hot and dry, and it's very hard to survive. And there's lots of extreme climate, and when rain finally comes, you get 2 meters of it. So either you have floods or you have drought. There's that sort of feeling that many people have about the about the outback. So that's also a very essential part of what it is to be Australian, is to associate with that. Just like in Norway, we have the mountains and fjords. Okay, the Sami have the reindeer, and the Australians have mining and farming in the outback, or cattle herding in the outback, sheep, etc. So when these things come into conflict with each other, these are two sort of main symbols of the national identity, and that's what makes it particularly interesting. There is a concept developed by an Australian environmental philosopher, of all things, and the concept is solastalgia, which is a neologism. It's a new term, and it refers to the sense of loss experienced when your surroundings change dramatically from one day into the next. In other words, accelerated change in the realm of the environment. And the guy who invented the term, he had been engaged in some resistance. At least he'd been interested in some resistance to coal mining in a place called the Upper Hunter Valley in New South Wales in Australia. Now, there's a reason why this part of Australia was called New South Wales. It looked like South Wales to the settlers who came there. Lush, green, good water, as I say, with enough rain, okay? And green rolling hills, perfect for agriculture and pastures for cattle and sheep. And it's also a coal-rich area, so very soon, or rather, not very soon, but given time, resource companies started to get interested in the same areas. And coal mining these days in most of the world is not I mean, the kind of, I don't know what kind of image you have sort of at the back of your mind when you think about coal mining, about people walking in tunnels, okay, underground with little lanterns, you know, and maybe a pick, you know, and a wagon that they put the coal into. It's not like that, it's open pit. It's open pit. So they rip up the topsoil, and they just dig the way down to the ground. So the typical coal miner in a country like Australia is not a guy who walks underground. He walks down the ladder, deep down into this sort of the interior of the earth. It's a guy who sits on a very large machine, you know, with an air-conditioned cabin, okay, with his Pepsi Max, and with a headset and air conditioning, and pushes and shovels huge quantities of soil and rock and eventually coal around. So it's much more visible. That's the point. I mean, an Australian and coal mines in most parts of the world, they're much more visible now than they would have been just a couple of generations ago. So this led to, for many farmers, the sense in which that from one day to the next, their surroundings had changed dramatically. Have I spoken about this before? Nobody is, okay. Because I spoke about this, but it must have been to someone else. I'm glad to hear that. Because the mines, the resource industries, they bring with them a few things, such as noise and dust. Even if it's not fracking, even if it's just conventional coal mining. Noise and dust and increased traffic and new roads. But they also take away things, such as a starry sky. You know, one of the charms of living in the countryside, they would say in Australia, is that you can watch the stars at night. The sky is usually clear. It's dark. There isn't a town nearby. There is, you know, in the city you never see the stars, right? You have to go out. And all of a sudden, the starry night was gone because these mines, they operate 24 hours, right? They're really efficient. So they have floodlights on, and also to prevent intruders from coming in. They have floodlights on during the night. And even if the mine is 5 kilometers away, it takes away the stars. So yeah, so that's one thing. Yes, I also put here geopolitical implications. I don't think I'll have the time to go into that now, but it is to do with how the power shifts that result from the use of fracking technology. Because if the United States were to become, and that's also framing of some anthropological research that might be interesting. What would be the effects locally in countries, for example, which have been reliant on exporting oil to the United States? If oil production in the Middle East goes down and the production of energy through fracking in the US goes up to the extent that they become self-sufficient in energy, which has been a dream in the United States ever since it became industrialized and began to rely on importing energy. That might have some interesting implications for all of us. Okay, now a little bit about the Australian case. I've already said farming and fracking. Well, here, farming and drilling, farming and fracking, well, largely the same thing. Thousands of little wells. And the law in Australia is such that you cannot legally refuse a resource company from entering into your property and do exploratory drilling. But if they find something, they have to negotiate with you. But you cannot legally refuse them because you only own, as a landowner, you only own the top. Okay, you don't own that which is below. I mean, different countries have different legislation here. I'm not sure about Norway. If we own everything, I don't think we do. But maybe someone knows. So farming and fracking, yes, and they depend on underwater, underground water resources. And you have this vast sort of network of shallow underground lakes called the Great Artesian Basin. And you see it here on the map. This is Rockhampton. This is where I did my fieldwork, just south of Rockhampton in Gladstone. And you've got Brisbane. And so you see that it covers a very large part of the interior of Australia. Along the coast, eastern coast, there is rain. Here you have the so-called Great Dividing Range, which is a range of, well, hills and low mountains. They're not high enough to impress a Norwegian, but they divide the coastal strip from the interior in a climatic sense, so that beyond the Great Dividing Range, the outback begins. Because of the Great Artesian Basin, you can You can have cattle farms in Longreach, you know. In Birdsville, you can have a cattle ranch. Whereas in Western Australia, you can't. Western Australia is barren. It's desert because they don't have an artesian basin. So this is absolutely crucial for farmers to be able to access water through drilling. Otherwise, there would have been no farming. There would have been no town. There would have been no town here. And look at the web of roads. The network of roads also indicates that there is quite a lot of traffic here. There's quite a lot of activity going on. People who actually live there and who depend on it. And this is exactly the same area where fracking is also now taking off in a big way. Now let's see. The upper Hunter Valley would be a little bit further down here. So. That's a source of conflict, and here you have an interesting local resistance movement. As I said, you cannot legally refuse resource companies from entering into your property and do exploratory drilling for resources. But what you can do is you can make it more difficult for them by locking the gate and refusing them to enter. So they would then have to somehow break the law and intrude into your property. They would have to, bring with them equipment to cut across the locks and enter forcibly, which the resource companies in Australia would not be likely to do. In other countries they would, but in Australia they wouldn't, because it would give them bad press and it might ruin their sort of reputation as good citizens. So the Lock the Gate Alliance, which it's a large sort of NGO, which has thousands of members. Australian farmers who say no gas mining on our prime agricultural land. So that's one form of local resistance which has proved, at the moment, has proved to be much more successful than people had expected. Now, the film. Yeah. I'm going to show you a little bit more later on, but just a few comments about this this film. As you see, I mean, it's a very clear illustration of the sort of the different interests here. And one of the conclusions that I've been drawing after having worked in Australia on these and similar issues during my recent fieldwork is that Australia is a democracy in the sense that anyone can voice their opinion. I mean, anyone can make critical TV programs like this. And it was aired on ABC, which is the state channel, and it's out there on the web. Anyone can view it any time. So many Australians have seen it. You can say whatever you like. Whenever a new industrial development is being planned, or a mining development is being planned, or a new coal port, they're building coal ports all along the Queensland coast now, and the existing coal ports are being expanded in order to cope with the increased demand from Japan, China, and India. You can protest. You are being invited by local government to public hearings where all sorts of groups, anything from recreational fishermen to farmers to local business people to environmental groups are invited in. And they are invited to submit their views. And they can also submit them in writing. And the government would then say, and the resource company would say, well, thanks very much. We're so grateful for your views. And then they just go on with the business as usual, as if nothing had happened. So in other words, there is a feeling that you can rant and rave, and you can claim that your rights are being violated, etc. And it will not necessarily have any consequences insofar as big money is involved. And when the mining minister of Queensland spoke about the royalties, it's a tax, right? It's a mining tax that they pay to the state. So in other words, jobs, money. Who can argue against that? It's not easy. Yeah, I have another example as well, but I'll just move a little bit forward here. There is an interesting laconic people. I mean, Australians. I mean, they keep their cool. Oh yeah, something wrong. I mean, it's a bore that he's entirely dependent on, not just for his cattle or for his pastures, for irrigation, but also, I mean, the drinking water comes from the bore. Right, and when you saw it, when you lit it, it flared up. So in other words, there was a lot of gas in that water, and this also means that a lot of that gas, a lot of that methane escapes into the atmosphere. Right. I don't think I have any more slides now. Let's see. Maybe I have another one. Oh yes, there's a final article. Oh dear, I was going to say something else, but then I guess we have to talk about that final article by Stefan Dalsgaard. No problem. What I was going to say was basically, but I may be coming back to that towards the end of this course, about some other examples of local conflicts between large corporations and local communities, which is also a major research area for overheating, and which fits into the Australian case, and well, there are many other cases from around the world where we see similar things happening. Where many people in local communities simply feel that they are being overrun by big money and by major economic interests. But we now have to move on very quickly, okay? Last 5 minutes. And there's another lecture at 2:15. I hope you'll make it. Just time for a break. About this interesting new field that has emerged, which is what Stefan Dalsgaard's article is about, as a result of the increasingly widespread and influential consensus about the reality of humanly induced climate change. Now, the concept of the Anthropocene, which was proposed around the year 2000, is probably a direct result of this concern. The concern with humanly induced climate change. And the people then went back and they noticed that, well, maybe we could say that this started in an incipient embryonic form about 200 years ago, and it is now finally bearing fruition. We are actually changing the climate in very measurable ways. So as a result of this, as you would know, there is this flurry of international conferences, attempts to make climate agreements, attempt to make the polluter pay in one way or another. You know, that's a slogan which is heard sometimes at these conferences, make the polluter pay. But how on earth are you going to do that? And how are you going to put a value on carbon dioxide? I mean, when Stefan Dalsgaard writes about the value of carbon, he doesn't mean fossil fuels, but he means emissions, right? He means mostly CO2, okay, carbon dioxide, but also methane, which is another greenhouse gas. And there are all sorts of interesting things to look at when we try to study the discourse about carbon or CO2 emissions. Because how are you going to put a value on emissions when the consequences of these emissions are not known? And how are you going to make the polluter pay? There are a number of ways in which this is being done, and he goes through some of them, but not all. So I'll mention a couple. More. You have the cap and trade system, which has been implemented to some extent. Yeah. Well, this is going to be useless. I mean, there's no light, so I'll give it a try anyway. The cap and trade and quota systems. That each country, as it were, has a set quota, which has been agreed upon through international agreements in Kyoto or somewhere else. Rich countries generally treated more severely than poor countries because of the acknowledged need for the poor countries to be allowed to develop, to use more energy and not less, whereas the rich countries were penalized more heavily. So the quota system has sort of been put into place. I mean, that's what it describes. And the cap and trade, which means that when you have reached your limit, you can buy quotas from others. Or you can, now that's one thing that he doesn't write so much about, or you can find a way of, that's a term which is used a lot in Australia, offsets. In other words, if you pollute a lot more than you should, and you pump out the oil of the North Sea, for example, faster than you should, you can somehow make amends by planting a lot of rainforest in Brazil, right? Or you can pay people in Guyana for not doing things that they would otherwise have done, such as cutting down rainforest, which is a very strange form of activity, isn't it? I mean, to get paid for not doing anything, for lying in your hammock. I mean, that's not what they say. Of course, they have projects that they should, ecologically sustainable projects that this money is ostensibly for. But the message that is being received in some countries in South from the North through the offset practice is that they pay us money to do nothing, right? Instead of buying our products. So we have Yeah, so there have been attempts, and that's really what he's talking about, the attempts to discursively establish the value of carbon emissions and to gauge the relationship between a certain number of trees in the Amazon and a certain amount of oil from the North Sea. And it's not easy, and it illustrates what Dalsgaard calls, he quotes someone who says, the clash of the eco-sciences. I mean, economy and ecology. I mean, what I call the double bind between sustainability and growth. The clash between economy and ecology. And as this program from Australia showed, I mean, there's a very clear clash, and not just between economy and ecology, but also between economies on different scales, which again I think can be used to illustrate the role of scale when we think about globalization. You have small scale economic activities, such as farming, and then you have large scale economic activities, such as fracking or mining. And when these two meet, which one does the government choose to support? Well, in this case, it was quite clear, wasn't it? But that's the clash of ecosciences that Dalsgaard writes about is about climate versus growth. And it seems to him, or it seems to many people who think about this, that you cannot really have it both ways. And he discusses, I mean, the article is perfectly legible, but let me just mention a couple of things since we have a couple of minutes left. And he mentions different forms of incentives which are being discussed. Should you and I, for example, start to compost our kitchen waste? Would that help? Should we start to take a bike to work instead of driving? Should we stop taking planes when we travel, etc.? Lifestyle incentives. Or should we have a taxation system which makes it profitable for you and me to buy local food instead of imported food? And local food which is sustainable, which has not been raised on soybeans from Brazil. That sort of thing. Or should we focus instead on the industry? And how can these things be compared? And how can one create a system of value that makes it possible to measure the effects of various incentives and constraints? This is quite complicated. It's economics, right? And it's a new economics because historically, at the time of Marx and Morgan and Leslie White, natural resources were free, basically. The only cost of natural resources was the price you possibly had to pay for a lease. You know, you had to pay for the right to extract them and the price of the actual extraction. And now increasingly economists and the people who are involved in climate negotiations are trying to find a way of measuring the ecological effects of economic activities, right? So that you have to pay for the unintentional side effects of what you do. And it's very complicated when it goes up to a global scale. And so there are lots of more things to say about this, but I just like to highlight one to anchor this rather abstract argument in Stefan Dalsgaard's article in the Mainstream Anthropology. One, it's about value, it's about valuation. There's a rather good article that some of you may have come across. It was controversial when it was published by Fredrik Barth on transactions, on how value is being established through continued transactions and negotiations. In other words, its value is being established as a kind of social construction, given a shared understanding of what the transaction is about. And this is what still is a little bit fuzzy. That's one. Second, it can also be anchored in economic anthropology by looking at, as he does briefly, the theory of economic spheres, which is also a mainstream old-fashioned economic anthropology, that you have one set of goods which circulate in one sphere, which could be food, for example, and you have another set of valuables which circulate in another sphere, and they cannot really be converted because they belong to different realms. And the crucial question here, as he sees it, is to find a principle of translation between the sphere of economic activity and the sphere of ecological sustainability. And I think it's fair to say that this is to some extent where we are at the moment in the anthropology of energy. Notwithstanding the study of energy in societies where there isn't enough, but in a more global comparative sense, that's probably where we are, trying to find principles of translation between that which is to do with ecology and that which is to do with the economy. And both of them are mediated through human agency and human societies. There will be a full lecture on the anthropology of climate change by Astrid Stensrud later in the semester. So I think we can leave it at this. And are there any questions? You're so quiet. Okay, I think probably next week. I'm not sure. I haven't decided yet. I may be using Prezi next week. I may also revert to my old ways of using the blackboard. But it's been a fun experiment, but I'm not sure if I'm going to continue doing it. So thanks for coming and see you next week.